Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, wildlife camera traps, capturing wild nature in photos. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for joining us here today. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic because there have been some recent advancements in camera trap technology that allowed me to break into the field because it's been prohibitively expensive. There's been a lot of gear that you need to buy to be able to convert your full frame camera into a game camera that can remotely trigger when animals are going past the field of view. And recently, some new technology has come out that converts existing cameras into a camera trap with no need for extra equipment. So it's allowed me to kind of get into the game of wildlife photography using camera traps. And I wanted to share that with you. And we're going to cover just a couple things today. My path to photography, getting to know your heroes. This is a huge part of being a professional photographer, is seeking out the people that you look up to in the field and that you want to learn from. So much of getting better at photography is just looking at examples that you love and trying to dig into what the photographer is doing compositionally, and through editing to be able to achieve a certain look or effect or moment. So we'll dive into one of my heroes today, and then we'll take a look at what process I'm using to be able to use my mirrorless camera as a camera trap. And finally, we'll end with a question and answer session. So please submit your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll be happy to answer them as we continue. But my path to photography really started in the field as a researcher. I was studying softshell turtles, which actually isn't pictured here. And while I was doing that field research, catching turtles, collecting data, I was also traveling with a camera in the field because I was taking photography classes at the time, and I had a camera on loan from the photography department. And while I was capturing pictures of all of these critters, I just got this huge excitement about trying to reveal hidden worlds to other people. And a big part of that is, for me, is trying to bring out the personality of creatures that some people don't have a chance to get to meet, like frogs, turtles, snakes, all of the unsung heroes of the wildlife kingdom. And that led me to a career in science communications. I do writing, photography, and video work for a wide array of clients. And most recently, I've been also designing exhibits, most recently at the Wild Center here in the Adirondack Park, which is where I live. And through my consulting business, Two Line Studio, I also have the opportunity to guide expeditions with Natural Habitat Adventures. And Natural Habitat Adventures is just such a natural partner because it is so intentional in how travel is carried out. So, all of the vendors that NatHab works with have a conservation focus and are thinking about how to make their operations sustainable. And I guide trips in Grand Teton, Yellowstone National Parks, as well as this fall I'll be guiding on the coast of Maine. And I also guide on the Michoacan, Mexico butterfly migration. So all of the monarch butterflies funnel down to the Oyamel fir forests and high elevation transvolcanic mountains, and it's a surreal experience to be able to see them. And on all those trips, I'm helping guests to explore photography, whether it's on their phones or on their cameras, and try and take what they do to the next level. But today, we're really going to be talking about one specific side of photography, and that's uh, wild camera trap photography. So this chapter is going to start with knowing your heroes. And I'd love to kind of tell this ecological story of the impact that photography can have on the world of conservation and our understanding of the wildlife kingdom. And if you look back at about 2014, this would have been when I was in graduate school at the University of Wyoming, we discovered the longest land mammal migration in the lower 48. And this migration is done by mule deer. It's a twice yearly migration, 150 miles, longer than any other land mammal in the lower 48. You can see this article was published in April 2014 by National Geographic. All of the data was coming out of University of Wyoming. And one of University of Wyoming's strengths, obviously I'm a little bit biased because I'm a graduate of that program, but one of their strengths is that their research is always partnered with figuring out how to communicate that research to the public so that any information about natural resources can help people decide how they would like to make management decisions about those natural resources. In this instance, there were researchers that were looking into the migrations of a lot of ungulate species, so pronghorn mule deer, moose, bison, all of the big charismatic megafauna of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And they were using GPS collars to be able to figure out where they were migrating and how far, and it completely blew away our understanding of how far these animals are traveling. And at the same time, there were photographers and artists with the university who were documenting this migration because, as you can imagine, this has a lot of implications for how we manage wildlife crossings across roads and habitat connectivity. And University of Wyoming had some big forethought in planning and thinking about, hey, if we team up with photographers and cover the research, when we go to publish the research, we'll have photographs that we can use to be able to help tell this story. And ultimately, that led to this incredibly successful implementation of wildlife crossings. So this is in 2022. The first wildlife overpass on Interstate 80 is to be built. And so let's dive into how did we get there? How did we get to a place where we were doing multi-million dollar projects to be able to help wildlife move successfully across a landscape? And a big part of the answer to that question is we hired and worked with photographers, and in particular, camera traps. So this is the basically the homepage of the Wyoming Migration Initiative. And this is where they're starting to publish all the information about these migrations that we had no idea about. And a lot of this information is published in Wild Migrations, an atlas of Wyoming's ungulates. The information embedded here is absolutely outstanding. And the person who spearheaded the photography, you can see his copyright here in the center of this image, is Joe Reese. And he has since become a National Geographic photographer and explorer. And he pioneered some truly incredible camera trap methods to be able to tell the story of these animals as they moved across the landscape. One of the biggest challenges that photographers experience with trying to get compelling wildlife photographs is proximity. You know, you think about how to get a great photo of a person. Often it's getting really close and comfortable with that subject and working in a variety of situations. But with wildlife, you're really just you don't want to affect their behavior, and you want it to be able to get up close. You really can't do that in person. And so camera trap technology breaks down that barrier and allows you to get this close to an animal with a fairly wide angle lens, with a couple of things to be able to help get you there. Number one is ecological knowledge. You have to know where are these animals traveling, at what times of the year, and what specific pathways. And that's where Joe Reese was working with the researchers who were tagging, collaring these animals and following where they're moving. So he was able to set up his camera traps directly in the path of the migration and capture animals fording rivers or ultimately crossing barbed wire fences. And he was able to tell this really compelling story of wildlife on the landscape in a really natural way because he was using camera traps. Now, you might be thinking, like, are these off the shelf camera traps that you would buy at the store that are $200 or even cheaper? No, these are full. At the time, Joe Reese was using a full DSLR because mirrorless cameras weren't out yet. So this was, early 2000s. And he was using a huge custom rig to be able to remote trigger the camera. The camera's in standby mode, and then there's a remote trigger that tells it to take a picture if it detects motion. And then he had a flash rig that would allow for proper composition and exposure of the image. Looking at this image, you've got a baby pronghorn trying to get through this barbed wire fence. And it's images like this that have taken that peer-reviewed science uh, data, that those articles, and just catapulted it into the public image. And so it's through this wildlife camera trap technology that we're able to get up close and personal with wildlife without affecting their behavior and capture moments that we just wouldn't otherwise see. Joe Reese, if you look up wild migrations of pronghorn mule deer in Wyoming, his photos are going to come up first. And this is an issue that it's so new. People are still learning about it, and we're still funneling new funding into these projects to help address wildlife crossings in North America. So this is kind of what a rig would have looked like what if you wanted to convert your camera into a camera trap. But recently, this has been changed because a lot of times people would kind of either buy these custom rigs to outfit their DSLR, or they would make them themselves because you're trying to create a housing for the camera that's waterproof and that can stay in the field. You're trying to set up a lighting system because often your wildlife are active in the early morning and the evening. So you're trying to, uh, make the best shot that you possibly can with the tools that are available. And often for me, this was just cost prohibitive. I just couldn't break into it because of all of the equipment. And you really need to know what you're doing. You need to test it out. A huge part of photography is trying out the different variables and making small adjustments to be able to improve. And in this instance with camera traps, it's like that to 100. You have to be really patient and really willing to put in the time to be able to get that one image that is really powerful. Now, the game has changed recently. In particular, I happen to be a Nikon user, and so we're going to talk about some technology that Nikon just released for free if you have a Z8 or a Z9. So my process is really reliant on that. This technology is called auto capture, and it's basically everything that you would be creating and controlling if you had a custom rig like what we were looking at before. So if you have a Z8 or a Z9, you would need to update to the latest software to be able to then find auto capture in your menu settings. Um, but I'm going to try and talk about this and talk you through this process so that regardless of whether you have a custom rig or are using a different type of camera, you can take some tips and tricks from this to be able to try and test this out with other technology as well. But I'll be using specific examples and menus from the Z8. So before you even get into this, there are a few things you need to take into consideration and plan. First off, you really need to know wildlife ecology. You need to know where the wildlife are going to be. You need to have access to where they're going to be. And it needs to be on private land where you have permission, or you need to go through a really lengthy process to get permitting if it's a state park or a national park. You also have to think about timing and light. There are a couple tools that can be helpful with that. One of which is Google Earth. You can actually go into a specific location and see what the light might be like at a certain time of day. But mostly this is just boots on the ground. You need to get out, track wildlife, figure out where they're going to be, And the place that I'd recommend starting is backyard birds. A lot of us have bird feeders, and that's a great opportunity to test out your equipment, get your process dialed so that when you go further afield, you can kind of take what you learned and just deploy it. So the second big thing is kind of picking your spot and the angle. So you're again going to want to think about what is the sun going to do in the period of time that you're planning to capture uh, content. For me, I'm usually setting my camera out for 3 to 4 hours. I'm not doing overnights quite yet, mostly because of some of the limitations that we'll talk about with this new technology. And so you really want to think about, okay, if I'm setting the camera up now and I anticipate the wildlife is going to move into frame in this location, where is the sun and where is it going to be in 3 hours? And then plan accordingly, both for your exposure settings as well as the angle of your camera in relation to the sun. Because once you get everything set up, you're going to leave it. And you'd hate to have everything get ruined just because you didn't think about where the sun was going to be when the animal might be coming through. And then the other thing too is as you're deploying your camera, you want to bring an object that is roughly the size of the subject matter that you're trying to capture to be able to practice with it. So even, sorry, my dog is choosing right now to lick. Make sure he's not doing that. So you're going to want to bring some object. If you're photographing a frog, bring out a small object that's the same size as a frog. You can even get like plastic models, like toys, that kind of replicate the size and shape of the animal. And you want to put that object into frame and trigger the camera with that object. You can even use your hand, or if it's an animal that's at your size, you can be the one moving through and try and match the gait and the timing of the animal to properly see if the camera is going to be able to trigger as you move through the field of view. So this is the most important part. Everything next is just kind of the technical aspects, but the difference between someone getting great wildlife photography from camera traps and getting mediocre or none is whether or not they can do these three steps. So the next part, getting ready to actually take the photo, is physically setting up your camera and your tripod, setting all of your exposure settings the way that you want. And I'd recommend using, if you're using Nikon's auto capture technology, I would set it to aperture priority, adjust all your exposure settings the way that you want them, anticipate the lighting that we were talking about, and ultimately set your autofocus to AF and then wide L so that you have a large box that auto detects whether there's something in the frame and then focuses accordingly. Another thing that I'm trying quite a bit is actually manual focus. So if I know a wildlife is going to be moving through the frame from point A to point B, I'll set the focus so that when the animal is exactly in the right spot, the camera will trigger and you'll have the focus in manual. Because every once in a while with autofocus, it's just not going to grab the right place on the animal. And for me, if the eye isn't perfectly in focus, the image is no good for the vast majority of compositions for wildlife photography. Next step is setting the actual auto capture settings. So if you're not a Nikon user and you don't plan to be, this next couple minutes here won't be that useful, but it's interesting to get a window into how this is happening because you can guarantee, I actually don't know if other brands are doing this or have already done it, but you know that if Nikon has released it, all the other companies are going to do the same thing. So this will be headed your way as well. So from the photo shooting menu, again, you have to do the software update. Your camera's not going to come with this from the factory. You're going to open auto capture. You're just going to go into start and get this thing going. From there, your screen is going to look something like this. And I'm going to give you some really brief tips to be able to navigate this because this can feel a little bit overwhelming. What I've found is that and it seems like from my read, the way that camera companies are working right now is that they're releasing new software onto cameras that you've already bought, that are allowing for new functionality. They're kind of flying the plane as they build it. And in this instance, I think there are a couple areas where they've nailed it and it's working really well, and a couple areas that I would kind of highlight and like coming attractions. They're not quite developed fully yet, but I anticipate in the next software release that they're going to address some of these bugs. So for me, this is kind of the backyard birds setup. Number one, you're going to open up that it's labeled here as number one, motion and detection and distance. Do not check the box for subject detection or distance. In an ideal world, the camera would have enough technology to know if an animal enters half a meter away from the camera, it'll cause it to trigger. What this does is essentially, if you have branches that are moving that are causing the motion to trigger, it'll it'll mitigate that by telling it, hey, anything past 2 meters, don't pay attention to movement in that area. Only pay attention to movement when it's about 1 meter. You set the distance. I have not had success doing that. For me, if I set a distance on this technology, it's simply not taking pictures. Again, I've tested this. I would say I've given it a good try. I haven't done it a thorough testing. Like, I'm still in the process of getting to know this. So it's possible that this is an error on my end and not on Nikon's. But for me, I just simply select motion detection and ignore distance and subject detection. Ultimately, I think the camera is going to be smart enough where if you select bird in subject detection, it's only going to trigger if it sees a full bird in the frame. But for now, just selecting motion is the way to go. Next, I set speed to 1 and size to 1. Essentially, that's um, by a bigger number, it goes 1 to 5 on both of those items. If you select a bigger number, it's essentially saying only trigger if something really small comes into frame. For me, I'm just going kind of broad strokes. I don't care if the camera takes thousands of photos. I'm happy just kind of going through and selecting the best photo. But feel free to play with this and kind of dial it in to the type of subject matter that you are photographing. Again, for me, I'm doing a record time of 5 seconds when I'm doing video, or a photographing period of 5 seconds of continuous shooting, and then wait a second. And if the subject is still in frame, do it again. And one consideration for the interval that you set here is whether or not you're using an external power source. So if you're able to physically plug in, if you're in your backyard, or if you have like a huge power supply that you might use like at a job site if you're a contractor, those are really great for powering a continuous light or also powering your camera. The Z8 and the Z9, I can speak to those because that's what I use. They have specific batteries that can go in the camera that you can use a power delivery, hard line power to your camera, just simply by connecting through the port on the side, which is a really nice feature that we haven't seen before on mirrorless cameras until this model. And it makes a huge difference if you're trying to do something like this that has a big tax on the battery. Um, Light source is going to be really important. Ideally, you could just use natural light, but if you have either a continuous light kind of meant for filmmaking, that's the way to go, because so far with Nikon's technology, I've just found that there's no way to set a single image to trigger, or three slow separated images. And so you're going to overload your flash if you try to use flash. I just put together a little video because the very end, if you're trying to actually do this, is a little bit tricky. So you actually, once you get all your settings done in each of these boxes, then you click the little next button or use the button on your camera for info to be able to go to the next. Once you click on that, then you have to actually hit the record button or touch the screen to start the process of the camera to detect motion. And for sure, I would test it out. Like, put your hand into frame, make sure that the camera is actually triggering based on all of your settings. So it's not the most straightforward thing. But here, now we're going to get into some examples of what I've been able to do since using this. And for me, in the past, my go-to wildlife lens was a 400 millimeter fixed lens. And I never used my macro lens for wildlife unless I was photographing frogs or snakes or things you can get close to. And I was never using my wide angle lens because then it would just feel like you're so far away from your subject. But my two favorite lenses have become the macro lens and the 20 millimeter wide angle. This shot is with a macro lens, a 2.8 f, and it's of a blue jay. I was using a continuous light, and this blue jay just kind of landed right in the area where I wanted it to. We have bird feeders out back. And the focus I set to manual, so that if the bird was perfectly in the right spot, it would trigger. And the story that I love behind this is that blue jay pigmentation is actually not pigmentation. Blue jays have color because of the physical structure of their wings. It actually refracts light based on the physical components of their feathers and causes us to perceive the wavelength of blue. So there's actually no pigmentation in those feathers. So being able to take this super close up image of a blue jay wing allows me to help tell that ecological story. And here, this is a super close up shot of a chipmunk's ear. And it's a little bit jarring to be able to see these close up shots using a macro lens. You have to, like, in your head, you're like, gosh, this animal must be dead because how else could you get such a close up detailed shot of that animal? And in fact, this is just camera trap technology. Again, manual focus, entirely triggered by motion, by the animal being close enough to the lens. And again, I have the advantage of we have bird feeders in the backyard. So this is going to be, now that I've finished kind of getting to know this technology, the next step is deploying it further in the field. This has just been so much fun to use a macro lens to be able to get portraits. There's so much personality embedded in these. There's so much texture. I mean, I never knew that blue jays had these kind of whiskers coming off of their cheeks. And it's all because I have this new ability to be able to capture portraits of wildlife super up close in this setting. And here you're getting an idea of what that wide angle lens looks like. The wide angle is really a great place to start when you're getting into the game of camera trap technology because it gives you a wide field of view for the camera to capture motion. So if you're not sure exactly where the wildlife is going to end up or to land, if you haven't studied that area enough, you might need to set up a wide angle to kind of get a sense of where animals are moving throughout that area. Once you know, like, oh, the birds are always landing on this particular twig or this particular area, or you studied the tracks in the snow and you figure out exactly where they're moving through, then you can kind of hone in and use a longer lens to be able to tell a little bit of a different story. So I also did a test of let's see, I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen and share it separately for this. Just give me a quick minute here to readjust. So I also did a test of the video capabilities of this. And let me just see if I can get that as full screen as possible. And I was really happy with the results. So essentially, it's everything the same except you have your settings on recording a film for a certain length of time. And for this, I was using my 400 millimeter. And then in post editing, I did some panning movements because these cameras, the advantage is that they have so much data. And if you film at 4K and you're just posting on social media or something fairly low key, then you can actually punch into your footage into a tighter crop to be able to tell that story. And this was a really cool moment. I can't remember if it's at the end of this or the next one, but a huge advantage of camera traps is that we can actually capture some interesting behavior. there, that nuthatch just sequestered a seed, just cached a seed into that bark, which is really cool behavior to be able to see. So here's another quick video. This is all from camera trap technology. So I left my camera recording for about, gosh, it was probably an afternoon, 4 hours. And then I just edited what clips were there that were all triggered by motion detection. And I ended up with having a ton of footage. So I was actually doing something else. I was doing photo editing for another project while my camera was out working for me. That's the power of what's being released with our cameras. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation again and share that full screen. So it's just a really exciting time because our cameras are getting to a point where we're going to continue to see this trend where camera companies are releasing new software on cameras you've already bought for free. Uh, and so in this particular instance, I would say that with this auto capture technology, there are some limitations. Like I was saying, I just don't think subject detection is quite there yet. It's not triggering the camera properly for me. And the distance, I love that feature, but I just haven't figured out how to do it properly. You should be able to set, I want everything between a meter and 3 meters to trigger the camera to take photos, and it just hasn't been successful for me. There's also some limitations for the Nikon with battery overheating. So if you do have a moment where you're recording, that this camera has about 45 minutes to an hour and a half of full recording time at 4K before it needs to cool down. So the camera will automatically shut off. Most likely your battery is going to die before that because the auto capture does take quite a bit of battery load. And it's also not this feature. It's not compatible with Flash yet. I haven't been able to figure out how to force the camera to only take a single shot when it detects motion within the frame. Right now, it's going into burst mode, which will overload your flash and break your flash. So you don't want to do that. The other thing too is that you need to think about waterproof housing or even camouflage for your camera to be out in the field for an extended period of time. Right now, I'm still in kind of the backyard test phase before I deploy this out in some peatlands and bogs that I have targeted to be able to capture wildlife movements. Some opportunities. If you have the Z8 or the Z9, you now own a professional camera trap. That's insane. And for free. Of course, you had to make the investment in the camera. But prior to this point in time, if you had a big camera and you wanted to use it as a camera trap, you needed to invest in between $1,000 and $3,000 worth of gear and learn all the nuances of putting that equipment together to be able to do camera trap at this professional level. Now, if you have these particular cameras, it's accessible. The other aspect is that if you have a large battery to bring in the field, a big battery supply, you can power some continuous lighting options. There are a lot of different options. They're targeted towards um, essentially product shoots, but you can get these light boxes with built-in LED lights and you can choose how bright it is. And that's the box that I was using for a lot of those macro shots. I would bait the trap with a couple peanuts and the animal would come in, eat that peanut, and then be in the exact right position for both the lighting and the camera to trigger. So that's one way if you go continuous lighting to be able to have a great lighting setup if you're doing that kind of macro photography approach. Um, this is just a really exciting time in photography. I think that I'm curious to see like what other camera companies are going to do in this field, but I'm really excited that Nikon kind of bit this off and went for it. And a little disclaimer, I'm not sponsored by Nikon. Um, some of my work is featured on their website, but currently there's no kickback for this. I just wanted to talk about this technology because it's really cool. So I'd love to open it up to some questions and some ideas from the audience. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Now, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, so let's jump into some of these questions. Um, so we have one guest who is asking for recommendations for trail cams. They just want to photograph the birds and flying squirrels and other mammals in their backyard.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so many products on the market, and really what I'd suggest is figure out what's your price point and then do a Google search on what trail cam at that price point is the best camera for me. It's really going to come down to price points and then functionality. Some of them are Wi-Fi enabled, so if it's close enough to your house, you can get patched into your Wi-Fi to be able to have it send to your phone. Other ones are cellular enabled, so you can pay for $100 a year to be able to have them delivered to your phone, and you can put those in the field anywhere. But there's so many products out there that I don't really have a recommendation for what to use. This tutorial in particular is kind of more focused on kind of as a professional photographer interested in getting into wildlife photography. How do you do that with kind of professional level tools, which is kind of a different animal than camera traps? But your question brings up a great point that that's another way to scout locations. So if you put out camera traps, um, just kind of the off the counter, from the hardware store, you can buy a few for $100 each and figure out where animals are moving and what activities they're doing, and then set up your huge rig and get the perfect shot. That's another great way to be able to do that. But it's a little intimidating because there's so many options out there. But in my experience, I've owned a bunch of different brands of kind of the off the shelf versions, and I've never really been disappointed just because it's mostly about getting to see the wildlife and not necessarily about getting like a high resolution image of that creature. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Um, uh, what about for close-ups? Are these kinds of cameras good for close-ups? And do you have recommendations for anything that would be good for that?
Yeah, it really, if you want to do close-ups, it's really getting into the custom rigs, and then it's about what lens you're using based on kind of what animals are coming through. So for me, in the close-ups that I was kind of showing the images of, I'm using a 105 millimeter macro lens, and then your margin for error is tiny because that creature needs to be exactly in one place for the focus to be right for that to trigger and everything. So, um, it's a little bit of a learning curve to be able to figure out. But in terms of off the counter stuff, like there aren't too many off the counter options that are going to give you close ups of animals, except for those ones that are kind of built into a bird feeder so that you can have the bird land and get a picture close up of a bird. That's one option. But then how close you are to kind of an off the counter camera trap would just mean you need to figure out where wildlife are traveling to have them travel right next to your camera. So that would be in the winter, tracking them, figuring out where they have game trails, and then putting the camera right on the trail to be able to get that animal to go as close to your camera as possible.
So you did have a note that said not to use zoom lenses. Is that sort of why not? Because it's very difficult to capture an image that way.
Oh, so the zoom lens consideration, if you're going to leave your camera out for a really long time and you don't have the proper housing for your camera, you're going to want to avoid zoom lenses because there's a lot more opportunities for moisture to get into the camera. So that's really just like a consideration of making sure your gear is watertight. If you use prime lenses, there's less of a chance of water getting into the camera. For Nikon, the Z9 has a lot better housing. It's much more rugged. But regardless, if you're leaving your camera out for 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, you don't always know what the weather conditions are going to be like. So you just want to create some type of housing for your camera and it can be pretty low key. You could just kind of, there are a lot of backpack waterproof covers that you can wrap around your camera. Ziploc bag that's partially opened works as well. Um, so there are a lot of different options, but the zoom consideration, it is really hard to figure out where an animal is going to be if you're using a 400 millimeter lens. But if you're watching animals and they land on a certain perch, it's not impossible. But the zoom lens is just a consideration of moisture and protecting your gear.
So, are there any websites out there that use camera traps so that we can actually observe um, different animals, especially for the kids that we want to share with them?
Yeah, there are a lot of great ones. Gosh, I watched, could watch like birds fledging. You just can't, basically, a lot of conservation groups are using that as a way to get people engaged. Uh, the group that I worked for on the exhibit, the Wild Center, does a number of different wildlife cameras depending on the season. So, yeah, definitely kind of search around. And if there's an animal that you're interested in, just Google, that otter live cam and see if anyone has one. There's so many out there, but none come to mind that I would necessarily recommend that are happening right now. But I feel like in springtime that often happens with birds that are nesting.
Great, thank you. So, are we just waiting for technological advancements for a better camera so that our batteries don't die, or are there ways to hardwire a camera in so that you can have it continuously operating?
Yeah, there's still some limitations. I would say the technology is still working on it. Like I've hardwired my camera through that power delivery hatch essentially on the side of the camera. Um, Not sure if you can see that, but on the side there, that's a USB-C. And if you're using the compatible lithium ion battery in your camera, not all batteries uh, can receive power deliveries. You have to make sure that your camera is compatible with it and that you've got the right battery in your camera. And that will allow your camera to stay on indefinitely, but with the exception of if it overheats. And when I'm using it in the video setting, I have had instances where the camera overheats and it shuts down. In the photography world, side of things, I haven't had that happen because the camera just doesn't run as hot when it's doing photo operations. So you can have a external power supply that supplies 12 hours of power to your camera, and then you could set it out overnight um, in those instances. But the technology is not quite caught up to if you had an external rig for everything, it would physically be waking your camera up from sleeping. And the technology that's separate would be doing all the motion detecting that would then tell your camera, hey, turn on and start recording. And so that device doesn't overheat as quickly and can last on a really long battery. So there's still reasons if you're really wanting to do camera trap technology with a big camera, you still want a custom rig. It's just exciting for people like me who want to dip their toes in it and find out what's possible without having to invest in the whole rig. And maybe down the line, I'll be doing that. Maybe down the line, the camera companies will solve the riddle of having the camera overheat. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. Unfortunately, that is the last question that we do have for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for tuning in. I hope that I was able to answer some of your questions. And if you have any other questions about this or want to get in touch, feel free to reach me at my email, charlie@twoline.com, and check out my website, twoline.com/Pete, for all of the stories that you can possibly imagine about our wetlands, bogs, peatlands. A lot of my work is kind of centered around the conservation of those areas and the wildlife that you can find there. So you can subscribe to a monthly publication that comes out with information about those ecosystems. And if you're interested in doing a private lesson on some of this, if you have a Z8 or a Z9 and you want to get more into the mechanics, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to work with you. So thanks so much for tuning in. And you'll find me here next week, Friday, same time on the Daily Dose.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlie, for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. And if you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.